So it's been possible to install SteamOS on desktop for a while now, and in this video I'm going to take a look at exactly that using what some might call an entry-level desktop PC. This one has an RX 6650 XT and a Ryzen 5 5600, and I've pared it back. I'm only using 16 gigabytes of DDR4 2400 RAM in this, so I'm really keeping it more like something from 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago. A more kind of realistic, more average PC that more closely matches maybe the average PC that you might see in the Steam hardware survey. So I'm going to look at it in 8 games, and there's some old favorites in there, and a couple of newer games like Doom: The Dark Ages and Stellar Blade. And I'm going to look at 1440p and 1080p. Now specifically with 1080p I'm looking at the high preset, or sorry, actually the very high preset, or ultra, and the reason I'm doing that is because very often the ultra preset tests the CPU to a greater extent than just, you know, doing 1440p medium, for example, which I also do. So things like crowd density and so on. So it's also good to see, you know, not just how a GPU performs, but how efficient maybe more CPU oriented tasks are as well. So we'll have a look at that, and at the end, of course, after the usual kind of side-by-side footage, we'll take a look at a couple of charts that show what is the advantage, if any, for SteamOS versus Windows 11. So I think this was a good place to start, SteamOS versus Windows 11. In future videos I will look at SteamOS versus the likes of Bazzite and CashOS. But of course the natural place to start is the Linux versus Windows comparison. So let's have a look at how you install SteamOS, where the instructions are. We'll have a look at I think 36 benchmarks across 8 games, and we'll take a look at the charts and then give a summary at the end about what I think about SteamOS versus Windows 11. So how do you install SteamOS? Well, the first thing you do is go to store.steampowered.com/SteamOS. Now, one thing that I think people need to realize is that SteamOS, it's not really a desktop replacement for the likes of Windows or even a different distro of Linux. It's game focused, it's console focused, it's actually really handheld focused, to be honest. So it's not really designed for you to go away and customize the desktop environment. You can install apps, you could install your Office apps, LibreOffice, whatever you want, but it's not really designed for you to go messing around with your own kernel versions or install things using Pacman or whatever. In fact, you have to go really out of your way to set up Pacman on this Arch-based desktop. So what I think is actually more important really is this SteamOS compatibility check sign here, and I think that's what's going to make the difference and maybe drive things forward for Linux gaming. And what I mean by that is, while we've had Steam Deck verified for a while, SteamOS compatibility is a newer thing where if you develop a game that runs on SteamOS, which should mean a handheld, but could obviously mean a desktop PC as I've set up myself. If the game developers see the value in getting the SteamOS verified tick alongside their game, then that could actually drive a lot of game companies, and particularly those ones that implement those kernel level anti-cheat software solutions for multiplayer gaming and so on. It might just encourage them, you know, seeing that there's more handhelds using SteamOS. It would be nice to get the SteamOS verified. You know, it's not a Steam Deck, it's going to be maybe a Legion Go S or a ROG Ally of some kind, and they may want that verified to appear on the store page so that people know that it will run okay on the handheld that they've chosen to buy with SteamOS or to install SteamOS on. So that's what I think about SteamOS. I think this is a great experiment to show what's possible and why the likes of Microsoft and Nvidia should be a little bit worried about this. And it's, I think, one of the reasons why Microsoft would have delayed the their own Xbox and relied instead on the ROG Ally Xbox X or whatever it's called instead, because they would have been spooked perhaps by the success of Steam Deck, by the success of SteamOS, and the fact that there is that performance difference, particularly on AMD hardware. Nvidia should be worried as well, because we know what kind of company Nvidia are. They are relentless in their pursuit of the number one spot in every division that they compete in. So do they want to cede the whole Linux, SteamOS handheld space to AMD? AMD are pretty dominant in that space now. Obviously Nvidia have the Switch 2. If you do want to install it, what you do is you scroll down, and where you see use SteamOS recovery image, follow the instructions, you click on that link and scroll down to reimage/install SteamOS. So what you do is you click on download the recovery image. On Windows, when I'm using Windows to install an ISO, or in this case a BZ2 file, onto a USB drive, I've used Rufus very successfully, but equally on Mac or Linux you can use Balena Etcher. Okay, and that'll do the job quite well as well. And follow the instructions. When you do click on the link here, you agree to basically the license agreement, click on that, and when you click download, it'll download that .bz2. It might say version 3.7.7 rather than 3.7.8, but when you do install it and it does some updates, currently it'll end up as SteamOS 3.7.8. So follow those instructions to write the image file onto a USB. In my case, in my BIOS, I actually had to set it to the second partition. When it was defaulting to the first partition on the drive, it refused to boot up, but when I set it to the second partition, I had no issues. It just booted into the installer, and it's basically a one-click installer, and as long as you've got your AMD CPU or AMD GPU, you should be good to go. So that's really all that's involved. It was actually quite straightforward to get SteamOS installed. So up next is the edited game footage, and when you're looking at the footage, you'll notice that on the left hand side you've got Windows 11, on the right hand side we've got SteamOS, and we've got two different overlays. We've got the Afterburner overlay on the left and the Mango HUD overlay on the right, and they're a little bit different because I've kind of enabled lots of data, including all the CPU cores. On the right hand side there's a frame time graph that will look a bit spikier than the one on the left, but that's only because it's running at a different scale. So when there's a little bit of stuttering, for example, it will look much worse on the frame time on the right hand side, just because of the scale. You can see it goes from 0 up to 50 milliseconds, whereas on the left hand side in Afterburner it's a much smaller scale, so you won't see the peaks as easily as on the right. Other stats will include the name of the game, the preset, so 1080p very high in this case with Stellar Blade, and on the right hand side then we'll see both the average FPS and 1% lows, comparing Windows 11 to SteamOS, and you'll see the difference for SteamOS relative to Windows 11. So for example here we see that SteamOS was 2% faster on the average FPS, but 7% slower on the 1% lows. So hopefully that explains what you will be seeing, and with that we'll roll the footage and we'll talk after the footage. So there you have it. Let's summarize things after looking at 18 benchmarks across 9 games. And we'll see actually a very consistent picture here that I've seen in previous videos that I've done, especially ones using the 6650 XT when I've compared Linux to Windows. It does tend to be 5, 6, 7% of a difference in favor of a Linux distribution, and this is no different. We do see a good spread here from The Last of Us Part 2 being 20% ahead, down to Baldur's Gate 3 with DirectX 11 being more favourable for Windows. As I put in the note on that part of the footage with Baldur's Gate 3, that defaults to DirectX 11. It doesn't even give you the launcher. It does not make it easy in any way to get Vulkan running instead of DirectX 11. So that's why I've decided to just put the DirectX 11 here, because you can't really run it if you're an average user using Vulkan. But overall, just over 5%. If we then move on to the 1% lows, we'll see that it's even better for SteamOS here. So while there's maybe not that much of a noticeable difference for the average FPS, there is a noticeable difference in 1% lows across most of the games. There are a couple of very big outliers, especially Ghost of Tsushima at 1440p medium. That absolutely destroyed the Windows 11 version in the 1% lows. It was dropping down below 30 FPS, whereas it was much higher than that, over 60 FPS on SteamOS. On the other hand, another, I don't know if it's a strange outlier, but for me, Helldivers 2 at 1080p Ultra. Now obviously with the Ultra setting, that may be taxing the CPU in some way that SteamOS didn't like, but for whatever reason, Windows was smoother in that particular game. But apart from that, the picture is generally very favourable for SteamOS in terms of smoothness. So a little bit faster overall in the FPS, but quite a bit more smooth than Windows, I would say. And this is very, very consistent with other results I've seen. So SteamOS, it is at the end of the day another Arch-based Linux. I've tested Arch-based Linux before with the likes of CashOS and Manjaro, and this is a very familiar story. So that'll just about do it for this video. I hope you found it useful, and I will have more SteamOS content to come, and we'll check other CPUs and GPUs just to give a rounder picture. We'll go less powerful and more powerful. But with that, we'll wrap it there, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video. Do please consider subscribing, like and comment, and in the meantime, happy gaming.